Just a nurse. That's what the break room whispered when Danielle Ross walked past, and she let it stick like antiseptic on skin. 2 years at Oak Creek Memorial in Houston, and nobody knew her name. That was deliberate. That was survival. She had walked away from a life where people knew exactly who she was, and the weight of that knowledge had hollowed her out so completely that sleep became a luxury she couldn't afford. At 2 a.m., staring at hospital ceilings, she'd learned that anonymity was the closest thing to peace she could find anymore. So she became invisible on purpose, competent, quiet, the kind of nurse nobody remembered 5 minutes after she left the room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in amber, and Danielle moved through the pre-shift routine with the kind of precision that looks like hesitation to people who don't know better. Oak Creek Memorial's ICU smelled like antiseptic and failure. That was the honest version, the version she kept to herself. The filtered version was just the usual hospital perfume, bleach, recycled air, the metallic tang of blood beneath everything else. She clocked in at 6:13 a.m., 7 minutes before her shift officially started, because showing up early was another way to disappear. Early arrivals didn't draw questions. Early arrivals were just diligent. She pulled her shift report from the printer, for patients, 2 stable, 1 post-op from a bowel resection, 1 admission pending from a training accident, and felt her shoulders drop a ½ inch. Routine. Manageable. Forgettable. The way she needed it to be. Her scrubs hung loose on a frame that had learned to take up less space. Blue, standard issue, with a coffee stain near the pocket that she kept meaning to treat and somehow never did. The stain was useful. It made her look rushed, careless, human in a way that didn't invite scrutiny. Her badge clipped to the waistband read Danielle Ross, RN, in letters so small that people usually squinted. No middle initial. No credentials beyond the nursing license. Just enough information to do the job and disappear. Her hands, when she reached for supplies, trembled slightly, a detail her colleagues assumed was caffeine dependency, a nervous disposition, something explicable and unremarkable. It wasn't caffeine. It was muscle memory trying to reconcile who she'd been with who she pretended to be. Her hands remembered procedures she wasn't supposed to know about. They remembered the weight of tools she wasn't licensed to hold anymore. They remembered decisions made in darkness and dust that had cost lives and saved lives in amounts she still couldn't calculate. She moved through the unit with deliberate invisibility, checking monitors, updating charts, doing the 1,000 small tasks that kept patients alive without ever making it look like anything more than what it appeared to be. This was a skill too, just not one they taught in nursing school. 15 years of senior chief petty officer work had taught her how to move through spaces without being seen, and nursing provided excellent cover for that particular muscle memory. The other nurses, Sarah with the 3 kids, Marcus who was engaged, Jennifer with the tattoo of her dead brother, they bustled around her like she was furniture. That was fine. Furniture didn't get asked questions. The admission alert came at 7:23 a.m. Colonel Marcus Webb, unconscious, incoming from a training accident on a Black Hawk landing pad southeast of Houston. Delta Force. Ramadi veteran. The name hit her like a round she should have seen coming. She knew that name. She'd heard it in contexts she wasn't supposed to remember. Sarah bounced past her toward the trauma bay, and Danielle followed at the pace of someone who'd been assigned the task, not someone who recognized something in that call like a ghost recognizing itself in a mirror. Colonel Webb arrived in a state of controlled chaos, paramedics moving with precision, the kind of organized urgency that meant serious but survivable. Unconscious from blunt trauma to the head, possible intracranial pressure issues, they said. Training accident meant Delta Force, which meant no civilian doctors. Not really. The training had all been compartmentalized, but her hands knew things about tactical insertions and extraction injuries that would get her license revoked if she started rattling off in rounds. She stayed quiet. She stayed competent. She did the job without doing anything that looked like expertise. His tactical gear told stories that his file wouldn't. She could read them the way some people read books. The plate carrier showed wear patterns that matched 3 separate AOs, areas of operations, with the kind of detail only someone who'd carried that same weight understood. His boots were combat, genuine field-worn, not dress uniform issue. The leather had cracks that mapped out years of desert and mountain, and when she carefully removed them to assess for compartment syndrome, the smell of Ramadi dust and boot oil caught in her throat. She could see the treads embedded with red sand that didn't come from anywhere in Texas. Her hands assessed his tactical vest with the kind of familiarity that was dangerous. She knew the weight distribution, understood the load rating of the carriers, recognized the specific millimeter-thick ceramic that only certain units used. Her fingers traced the wear pattern on the left shoulder where a weapon strap had rubbed for thousands of hours. She moved with certainty, checking for thoracic injuries, understanding the vulnerabilities of plate carriers the way surgeons understood anatomy. When Sarah watched her, Sarah's eyes narrowed just slightly, but Danielle didn't look up. Looking up was a tell. Dr. Hargrove arrived at 8:15 a.m., exactly 40 minutes after Colonel Webb hit the ICU. He was the cardiac surgeon, not an ICU specialist, not trained in neurotrauma, but he was the one with the Pentagon connections. That was what mattered at Oak Creek Memorial. That was what had earned him the consulting contract, the speaking fees at medical conferences, the board appointments to hospital committees that controlled budgets and hiring, and the kind of institutional power that didn't require a title more specific than doctor. He moved through the unit the way colonels moved through bases, with the assumption that spaces arranged themselves around his presence. He watched Danielle remove Colonel Webb's combat boots. She was careful about it, precise in a way that communicated respect for the gear rather than just professional procedure. She cradled them, didn't drop them. She looked at the wear on the leather, the scuffs that couldn't be polished away, the way the soles had compressed and reformed around the shape of constant movement. Her hands, those traitorous hands that remembered everything, held them like they were something sacred. For 14 seconds, she held those boots like a person holds something that survived things she couldn't imagine. Like a person who knew what it meant to carry weight and stay standing. When she looked up, Dr. Hargrove was watching her. Their eyes met for exactly the amount of time it would take to misread a moment. She saw his gaze track from her hands to her face, taking inventory, cataloging something that didn't fit. She saw the calculation happen behind his eyes. She saw him understand, in the way that powerful people understand threats, that something about her was not the random assembly of 2 years' worth of nursing experience. "How long have you been a nurse?" His voice was conversational, the kind of question that wasn't actually a question. 2 years. She kept her voice level, unremarkable, the kind of voice that didn't carry history. She stored the boots carefully in the secure closet where they kept patient belongings, treating them the way she treated everything now, with precision, without attachment, without letting anything show. And before that? She turned back to him. This was the moment where civilians went wrong. They either over-explained or got defensive. Both things announced something. "Other work," she said. "I needed a change." She moved past him toward the monitors, resuming the pattern of tasks that made her invisible. But she'd seen something flicker across his face. Recognition of the kind that powerful men get when they encounter someone who might know more than they do. He spent the next 40 minutes in the unit, asking about Colonel Webb's medical status, examining the tactical gear with the kind of careful attention a man uses when he's trying to understand a threat. By lunch, Dr. Hargrove had asked the other nurses how long Danielle had been on staff. By afternoon, he'd made a call to someone with authority. Danielle didn't know this yet, wouldn't know it for another 3 hours, but the machinery was already turning. He'd identified something in her handling of Webb's equipment that didn't match her 2-year professional narrative. He'd seen her hands move with the certainty of someone who'd done this before, many times, in contexts that required more than civilian nursing training. The thing about powerful people is they can't tolerate unknowns in their domain. They can't tolerate mysteries that might diminish them. And Dr. Hargrove had built his entire reputation on being the hospital's singular authority on military medicine. A nurse who handled tactical gear like she understood it was a variable he couldn't control, and he would spend the next 72 hours trying to neutralize her before she became something he couldn't contain. What he didn't know was that Danielle Ross wasn't actually her name anymore. It was the name she'd reclaimed, the name she'd chosen, the name of the person she was trying to become. What he didn't know was that the boots he'd seen her hold with such reverence had walked through Ramadi with a woman who'd held a bridge alone for 8 hours while 6 Navy SEAL Team 3 operators extracted. What he didn't know was that the hands he'd watched work with such certainty on his patient's tactical vest had once performed a pericardiocentesis in a combat medic tent with nothing but a 14-gauge needle and the muscle memory that comes from watching people die and deciding that wasn't acceptable. And that was the only advantage she had left. Morning rounds arrived like artillery fire, methodical, devastating, and designed to be witnessed. Dr. Hargrove entered Colonel Webb's room at 7:24 a.m. with his entourage trailing behind him, 3 residents, 2 medical students, a pharmacist, all moving in the careful formation of people who understood the hierarchy and their place within it. His white coat was pristine, tailored, the kind that cost more than Danielle made in a week. She was adjusting Webb's cardiac monitor when she felt the temperature in the room shift, the way air changes when a predator enters. Danielle didn't look up. She was still speaking to Mrs. Webb about the colonel's oxygen levels, steady at 94%, breathing easily, lungs clear, when Hargrove positioned himself at the foot of the bed like a general surveying conquered territory. "Let's discuss appropriate boundaries," he announced to his entourage, loud enough that every word landed where it was meant to land. "Nurse Ross here has taken a particular interest in our patient's equipment. Tactical assessments, I'm told. Fascinating overreach." He turned to face her, and his smile was the smile of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. "Tell me, do they teach military history in nursing school now, or are you just a fan of war movies?" The residents shifted. One stared at his shoes. A medical student smiled uncertainly, waiting to see if this was humor before committing to laughter. Mrs. Webb's hands tightened on her coffee cup. Colonel Webb's eyes, still clouded from sedation but increasingly alert, tracked Hargrove with the precise focus of a man whose instincts had kept him alive through Ramadi and 3 deployments beyond it. He didn't trust what he was seeing. Danielle's jaw clenched once, tight as a fist. She took one measured breath, in through the nose, holding it for a beat the way they taught you in combat medicine training when you were standing over someone with their femoral artery severed and your hands were the only thing standing between them and exsanguination. She released the breath slowly. "I was ensuring his personal effects were properly documented, Doctor." Her voice was steady. Quiet. The kind of quiet that made people lean forward to hear it. Hargrove's smile widened. He was enjoying this. Personal effects. Is that what we're calling playing soldier? He used air quotes, his fingers making quotation marks in the air like a man conducting an orchestra of his own superiority. A medical student laughed, nervous, uncertain, the laughter of someone who didn't know which way the power flowed yet and was hedging his bets. Here's a teaching moment for everyone: nurses provide care. Doctors provide diagnosis. Let's not blur those lines, shall we? Rambo? His gaze swept the room, collecting admiration like currency. The silence was so complete you could hear the heart monitor's steady electronic pulse, beep, 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 the sound of a patient getting better despite the man standing at his bedside. Danielle's hands were steady when she continued documenting. Her expression hadn't changed. But her jaw had tightened, the muscle beneath her skin tensing like a coil being wound tighter and tighter, and she was aware that Mrs. Webb was watching her with an expression somewhere between confusion and alarm, unable to understand why this surgeon was speaking to a nurse like she was a child who'd been caught stealing from the cookie jar. One tear escaped her left eye. Not from fear. Not from shame. But from the particular fury of someone who had seen things Hargrove would spend his entire life unable to comprehend, who had held a field radio in one hand and her teammate's severed arm in the other, and had made the decision in that moment that she would save who she could save and grieve only after the mission ended. She wiped the tear away without looking away from Hargrove's face, her gaze meeting his with the kind of cold, flat stare that made his smile falter for just a fraction of a second, the expression of someone who had just realized, maybe for the first time, that the person he was humiliating might be more dangerous than he'd understood. "Those boots walked through Ramadi, Doctor," she said quietly. Her voice had dropped an octave. "They've earned more respect than this." Hargrove's smile froze on his face like something dying mid-bloom. The residents exchanged glances. Mrs. Webb sat up slightly, her eyes narrowing as she reassessed what she was witnessing. Colonel Webb's eyes tracked Danielle with the recognition of one warrior seeing another, a flash of understanding that said he was beginning to understand why this nurse had moved with such certainty when she checked his wounds, why her hands had been so confident when she documented his tactical gear, why she knew the weight of his boots meant something beyond their rubber soles and leather uppers. Hargrove closed his rounds early. Abruptly. Without comment. His entourage trailed behind him like remora fish after a shark that had lost interest in feeding, and within 90 seconds the room was silent except for the monitor's steady rhythm and Mrs. Webb asking quietly, "How did you know what his boots mean?" Danielle didn't answer. She was already moving to the next task, the next patient, the next moment in a 12-hour shift that suddenly felt like it was ticking toward something none of them could yet see. But that wasn't the worst part. The break room at 12:44 p.m. was occupied by 3 nurses when Danielle pushed through the door, Rachel from second shift, preparing to leave, Marcus, the unit charge nurse, scrolling his phone, and Emily, the new graduate still finding her footing in the profession. All 3 were seated, relaxed, eating lunch in the particular camaraderie that existed among people who spent their shifts in proximity to suffering and learned to find small moments of normal conversation as a form of survival. The moment Danielle walked in, something shifted. Rachel glanced up, and her expression crystallized into something that resembled recognition but was actually already calculating the nearest exit. "Oh," she said, and then, "I need to check on 404. She grabbed her lunch container, already standing, already moving toward the door. Marcus received an invisible page. Danielle watched his phone light up with nothing, watched him glance at it anyway, watched him stand with the practiced excuse of a man who had just received an urgent reminder somewhere else. "Pharmacy issue," he muttered, heading out. Emily hesitated in the doorway, her sandwich halfway to her mouth, her eyes darting between Danielle and the shrinking circle of occupied chairs. Then she swallowed, set the sandwich down, and walked out without speaking. 90 seconds. That's all it took for the break room to empty of everyone except Danielle and the fluorescent lights humming their insect-like drone from the ceiling. The room smelled like the particular amalgamation of every lunch brought from home, someone's spicy leftover, someone else's turkey sandwich with mayonnaise, the acrid tang of black coffee that had been sitting in the pot since 6 in the morning. Danielle sat down at the table they'd just abandoned, opened her lunch container, grilled chicken, brown rice, the kind of measured, disciplined meal that someone who'd learned to survive on MREs and field rations never quite outgrew, and found that her hands were trembling. Not from fear. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The same restraint that had kept her from laughing in Hargrove's face that morning, that had kept her from saying things that would have ended differently than a formal write-up and social abandonment. She set the container on the table and closed her eyes, and for the span of maybe 30 seconds, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what was happening, the realization that the boundary she'd drawn, the invisibility she'd worked so carefully to maintain, was already compromised. Hargrove's words had traveled through the hospital like shrapnel from an IED, fragmenting and lodging itself in every interaction, every glance. She opened her eyes, looked at her lunch, and couldn't eat. Her appetite was still there, somewhere behind the wall of adrenaline and something that felt like despair but tasted like old copper, the taste of blood from a wound you didn't know you had until the adrenaline wore off. She closed the container without taking a bite. At 4 p.m., the unit board in the main hallway became a monument to Dr. Hargrove's efficiency and his genius for weaponizing institutional machinery. The performance improvement plan appeared on bright yellow paper, the color designed to be noticed, to catch the eye the way a traffic warning catches it, the way a stop sign does. It was posted at eye level, positioned so that anyone walking past would have to see it, would have to read it, would have to consider the words written there about a nurse named D. Ross. Performance improvement plan, it read, in his precise, slanted handwriting. Violation, inappropriate familiarity with patient belongings. Observed handling military equipment outside scope of practice. Demonstrates poor understanding of professional boundaries. No signature yet, he was still collecting them, building his case brick by brick, constructing a structure that would be nearly impossible to dismantle once the weight of it settled. 2 nurses were reading it when Danielle walked past on her way to clock out, and she felt their eyes on her the way you feel eyes on your back when you're moving through hostile territory. She didn't look at them. She didn't look at the board. She kept walking, her expression neutral, her jaw set, her face a mask of the kind of composure that came from 18 years of learning that survival often required you to show nothing at all while the person standing next to you was stabbing you in the back. Her badge clattered against the tile floor when she unclipped it, the sound of metal striking ceramic echoing through the hallway with the kind of finality that felt like an ending. Hargrove was already pulling out his phone when she disappeared around the corner. She didn't see this, but she could feel it the way prey can feel a predator calculating distance and trajectory. He was opening his contacts list, scrolling to board members he'd cultivated for years, people who understood that supporting his research program was a form of investment in the hospital's prestige, in their own positions, in the complex network of favors that kept a surgeon like him comfortable and powerful. He didn't know yet what he was going to do with that network. But he knew the phone calls would need to be made. He knew that the nurse who'd stood in his rounds and held his gaze while a tear ran down her face represented something he hadn't accounted for, a variable that his education and experience had somehow failed to prepare him for, and variables needed to be eliminated. Hour 72. 2 in the morning. The hospital had contracted into that particular silence that comes only at the deepest part of night, when the day shift is home sleeping and the night shift moves through the corridors with the efficiency of people who've learned to work in a kind of perpetual twilight, checking monitors and adjusting fours and charting notes in the dark. The skeleton crew on the cardiac unit numbered maybe 6 people, 2 nurses, 1 tech, a respiratory therapist, and Danielle, moving between her patient assignments with the kind of systematic precision that would have looked like invisibility to anyone watching, just another nurse doing the job. Colonel Webb's monitor alarmed at 2:16 a.m. exactly. Not a gentle alert. A full system alarm, 3 sharp, insistent beeps that cut through the quiet like a blade. Danielle's head came up immediately. She was 3 beds away, checking the oxygen saturation on a post-op patient, and her body moved toward Webb's room before her conscious mind had fully registered the alarm. The monitor showed muffled heart sounds. Faint. Muted. The kind of heart rhythm that meant something was sitting on his chest, compressing his heart, suffocating it from the outside. His blood pressure was dropping like an elevator with a cut cable, 110/70 normal, then 95/60 2 minutes later, then 85/50, the numbers descending with terrible purpose. Danielle placed her hands on his chest, feeling the diminished heartbeat, the weakened pulse, the sensation of a man whose body was beginning its descent. She called for the pericardiocentesis kit before she called for the on-call resident, and when Dr. Chen arrived 5 minutes later, he was disheveled in the way of someone pulled from sleep, his white coat unbuttoned, his eyes unfocused. He looked at the monitor, looked at Danielle's face, and asked the question that told her everything she needed to know about his confidence level: should we call Dr. Hargrove? Pressure's at 70/40, Danielle said. Her voice had changed. The deferential tone she'd been cultivating, the careful boundaries, the invisibility, all of it had burned away, replaced by something older and more essential. We have maybe 5 minutes before arrest. Get me the kit. Chen stared at her. I've never performed a pericardiocentesis. Maybe we should wait for the attending. The entire night shift had gathered at the glass now, for nurses, 2 techs, a respiratory therapist, all of them drawn by the alarm, all of them watching a scene they didn't yet understand was about to become historical. The monitor displayed O2 saturation dropping, 88%, 84%, 80%. Colonel Webb's skin was turning the particular shade of gray that meant his body was beginning to fail, that the oxygen his organs desperately needed wasn't getting through because his heart was being crushed. Danielle didn't argue. She simply turned to the crash cart, opened the drawer that held the pericardiocentesis tray, a long needle, a syringe, alcohol and iodine for the site prep, the slim equipment of a procedure that required precision and timing and hands that had done this before. She'd done it in a combat medic tent in Ramadi with nothing but a 14-gauge needle and the knowledge that her teammate would die if she didn't. This was a hospital with all the equipment she could need, and still the physics were the same, fluid, compressed, needing to be extracted. She prepped the site beneath his xiphoid process, the lower end of the sternum, where the anatomy was predictable and the path to the pericardium relatively direct, with a solution that smelled like iodine, an antiseptic and possibility. 30-degree angle. The needle went in steady, muscle memory taking over completely, her hands moving with a kind of confidence that made Chen step back and simply watch. She felt the resistance as the needle penetrated the pericardium, felt the give as it entered the space beyond, and began aspirating. Dark fluid filled the syringe. 60 ccs of bloody pericardial fluid, the fluid that had been sitting on Colonel Webb's chest like a weight, crushing his heart with every beat. She withdrew the needle, and the change was immediate. The monitor's rhythm steadied. His oxygen saturation climbed, 75%, 82%, 88%, returning to normal like a survivor surfacing from water. His blood pressure began to recover, 75/40, then 85/50, then 95/60, the numbers ascending with the particular grace of a body being given a second chance. Through the glass, jaws had dropped. Someone whispered something that sounded like "she can't do that." Another nurse had her phone out, the screen glowing in the dark, recording what her instincts understood was a moment that mattered. Danielle was already documenting, already writing the note in Colonel Webb's chart with the kind of clinical precision that left no room for misunderstanding. Cardiac tamponade, pericardiocentesis performed, fluid withdrawn, vital signs stable, patient responding appropriately. Chen stared at her hands like they'd suddenly become something unrecognizable. "Where did you learn that?" She didn't answer. She was already moving through the aftermath with the systematic efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago that the best way to survive a moment of visibility was to move past it as quickly as possible, to blend back into the work, to become invisible again. But the night shift had other ideas. They'd seen all of them. And the knowledge was beginning to spread through the room like ink through water, the certainty that something they'd witnessed couldn't be unseen, couldn't be unexplained, couldn't be allowed to pass without consequence. Dr. Hargrove's car pulled into the parking lot at 2:23 a.m. Someone had called him. Danielle didn't know who, Rachel, maybe, or one of the nurses who'd abandoned the break room, who'd watched the performance improvement plan appear on the unit board and understood exactly which way the winds were blowing. He arrived disheveled but moving with purpose, his presence like cold air flooding a warm room. He found Colonel Webb stable. He found Danielle's note in the chart, written in her handwriting, documenting a procedure that nurses weren't trained to perform and certainly weren't authorized to attempt. His face went carefully blank. The kind of blank that meant calculation happening behind it, the machinery of his mind turning over the implications and the responses and the ways this could be managed. He looked at Danielle, really looked at her, for maybe the first time, and something shifted in his expression, a recalibration, a reassessment of the threat level she represented. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "My office. 8 a.m. sharp." The monitor shrieked at 2:07 a.m. One long, sustained wail that cut through the darkness of the cardiac unit like a blade through water. Danielle was 3 rooms down, charting Webb's post-operative vitals, when her head lifted. Not a question. A recognition. The sound didn't belong. She moved. The resident, Dr. Chen, fresh out of med school, maybe 30 hours into his first overnight, was already at the bedside, staring at the screen. The numbers falling like a stone down a well. Blood pressure dropping. Heart rate climbing. The rhythm on the monitor still organized, still regular, but the volume of blood the heart could actually pump was collapsing into nothing. Danielle was through the door before Chen reached for the phone. "What do you have?" Her voice was different in crisis. Flat. Efficient. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "I don't." The pressures. Chen's hands hovered over Webb like he was afraid to touch him. "Step back." Not a request. A command. Webb's eyes were rolling back, pupils blown. Skin cool, clammy. The telltale presentation of what her hands already knew before her brain finished the diagnosis: cardiac tamponade. Pericardial fluid pressing on the heart like a fist slowly closing. Every beat less effective. Every moment closer to arrest. The night shift was gathering at the glass. Danielle could feel their eyes, but she didn't look back. She'd performed this procedure on a combat casualty with worse light, worse conditions, worse odds, on the floor of a forward operating base in Ramadi with rounds impacting the concrete 15 meters away and her hand steady as surgical steel because hesitation meant watching a man die that she could have saved. This was just a hospital room. Clean sheets. For access. 14-gauge needle already at her fingertips from the emergency kit Chen had fumbled toward. 2 liters normal saline, wide open, she said to the nurse hovering near the fore-pole. And get me a drainage kit. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She didn't wait for acknowledgement. Her hands were moving, palpating the landmarks on Webb's thin chest. The space between his ribs. The exact geometry of anatomy that separated life from the void. She prepped the skin with betadine, the iodine smell sharp and familiar, grounding, and felt the needle slide between her fingers like it had 1,000 times before. The needle went in. A hiss. A soft, almost obscene release of sound as pressurized fluid escaped the pericardial sac. The hiss of air escaping a tire on a highway in the desert. The hiss that meant decompression. That meant chance. 50 milliliters drained into the collection chamber. 100. The monitor's tone changed. The rhythm smoothing. The pressure climbing back from the abyss. Oxygen's coming up, the nurse said. 80, 85. Webb's color returned like someone had turned a dial. From ash to flesh in the space of 30 seconds. 88, stable. Danielle didn't step back. She secured the drainage catheter with her eyes locked on the monitor, checking and rechecking the rhythm, the pressure, the oxygen saturation. The vital signs that announce survival or its opposite. Her jaw was tight, not from fear, but from the kind of focus that excluded everything else, the watching eyes, the fluorescent lights, the machines, the hospital itself. There was only the patient and the numbers. Only the choice between 2 outcomes, and she'd already chosen one. Sinus rhythm, she said quietly. He's stable. Get cardiology on the phone and book an ultrasound. We need imaging before the fluid reaccumulates. She stepped back. The room exhaled. The entire night shift had watched it happen through the glass partition, watched a nurse move with the terrifying fluid precision of a combat medic, watched her extract a man from the edge of irreversible shock, watched her speak with an authority that didn't belong to her title. They'd seen her hands. They'd seen the clinical certainty in every movement. Dr. Chen was staring at her like she was a different species. How did you, he started. Call it in, Danielle said. She was already removing her gloves, already moving past him toward the hallway. And post a note that he needs cardiac monitoring through the night. Someone needs to watch that drain. She was halfway to the sink when she heard Chen's voice, small and stunned, thank you. She didn't acknowledge it. She never did. She scrubbed her hands under water so hot it burned, and for just a moment, standing alone in the pre-dawn darkness of the hospital, she closed her eyes. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric song above her head. By 6:15 a.m., Dr. Hargrove was already in his office. The door was closed. The lights were on. The phone was pressed to his ear like he'd been waiting for the sun to rise just enough to make the calls he needed to make. His voice was smooth on the other end of the line to board chairman Gerald Moss, practiced, concerned, the tone of a colleague bringing bad news to a peer. Gerald, we have a liability issue. A nurse performed an invasive procedure without authorization last night. Cardiac tamponade situation. She performed the pericardiocentesis herself. A pause. Listening. No, the resident was on service. She simply took over. Scope of practice violation at minimum. Patient safety risk. I need you to support immediate suspension pending investigation. Gerald Moss didn't hesitate. Hargrove brought in $200,000 a year in grant money. Grant money meant research funding, publication opportunities, speaking fees at national conferences. Grant money made the hospital look good to accreditors. Done, Moss said. I'll call the chief nursing officer. By 6:19 a.m., Hargrove was on the phone with the staffing agency that had provided Danielle's references. Her resume only goes back 2 years, he said, his voice carrying just the right note of professorial concern. Employment history with you is solid, yes, but before that, nothing. No employment verification. No references beyond your agency. Either she was out of the nursing field or something was deliberately hidden. What happened before 2 years ago? The agency supervisor fumbled. Dr. Hargrove, we only verify current licensing and recent employment as policy. If there's a gap, then we need to file a formal request for credential review. This is a patient safety matter. A nurse performs surgery without authorization. If she's hiding something, the hospital needs to know. By 7:02 a.m., Hargrove had called the hospital's legal counsel and requested an outside investigator. By 10:11 a.m., Colonel Webb was awake. The morphine was wearing off. His chest hurt where the catheter was threaded, but his eyes were clear, and the first thing he did was look for the person who'd saved him. His wife, Sarah, 42, with dark hair pulled back tight and the exhausted expression of someone who'd spent the night believing her husband was dying, was holding his hand. What happened? He asked, his voice rough from the breathing tube they'd removed early that morning. You had fluid around your heart, she said. Your monitor alarmed. A nurse, one of the nurses, she did a procedure. The doctor said she shouldn't have, but you were, Sarah's voice cracked. You were dying, Marcus. She saved you. He wanted to sit up. Wanted to call her in. Wanted to say thank you to the woman whose hands had cut through the darkness and pulled him back. Then Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway. Colonel Webb, I'm Dr. Hargrove, the cardiac surgeon on your case. I wanted to update you personally on what happened last night. His voice was warm, paternal. Your situation was critical. However, there was a protocol issue during your care that we're currently investigating. A staff member performed an advanced procedure without proper authorization. We're taking that very seriously from a patient safety perspective. You'll have the best care going forward. I'm personally overseeing your recovery. Webb tried to ask about the nurse. His body was still too weak. The morphine was pulling him back under. By 11:38 a.m., Danielle was being called into the office of the chief nursing officer. The room was small, institutional, painted that color that was supposed to be calming but just made everything feel clinical. The chief nursing officer, Margaret Voss, a woman Danielle had worked for 2 years without ever really meeting her, was sitting behind a desk with a folder open. Risk management was there too. Hospital legal. Hargrove stood by the window like he was still deciding whether to be disappointed or vindicated. Danielle, Margaret said, and there was something in her voice that meant this was already over, we need to discuss last night's incident in the cardiac unit. Specifically, your performance of a pericardiocentesis without physician authorization. Danielle didn't sit down. She stood, her hands at her sides, her face composed and still as granite. The resident couldn't make the call, Danielle said. The patient was going into tamponade. Someone had to act. That's precisely the problem, the risk management officer said. Scope of practice violation. RNs are not authorized to perform needle decompression or pericardiocentesis. That's a physician's procedure. The patient would have arrested in for minutes without intervention, Danielle said. The facts were simple. The facts were unambiguous. Hargrove turned from the window. Which is exactly why the resident should have called a senior attending. Instead, you made an independent clinical decision that placed this hospital at significant liability. However competent it may have been, it exceeded your scope. Margaret looked at the papers in front of her. The write-up. The formal documentation. Everything already prepared. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending investigation. We're bringing in an outside reviewer to examine your credentials and your employment history. You'll surrender your badge and access before you leave today. The words came across the desk like a sentence being read aloud in a court where the verdict was already decided. Danielle didn't flinch. Didn't tremble. Didn't ask to speak to a union representative or a lawyer. She simply nodded once, acknowledging the words without accepting them, and walked out of the office. By 12:15 p.m., she was standing at the charge nurse station, removing her ID badge from her neck. Emily, who'd been hiding in the supply room when Hargrove had humiliated her, was watching with guilt written across her face. Danielle looked at her once, no anger, no judgment, just the flat gaze of someone whose kindness had been noted and filed away for later, and set the badge on the desk. She walked out of Oak Creek Memorial in her scrubs, her name embroidered over her heart like it meant something. The parking lot was bright with midday Houston heat. The asphalt shimmered. She reached her car and sat in the driver's seat with the door open, hands on the steering wheel, unable to turn the key. Unable to move. Her phone buzzed. A text from her son, "Hey Mom, you coming to pick me up from Rock?" She stared at the message. Inside the hospital, in his office with the door closed, Hargrove was already calling the medical director to brief him on maintaining standards and protecting the hospital from liability. His voice was calm. Professional. The voice of a man who'd just eliminated a threat without ever having to raise his voice. He didn't know that the woman he'd just destroyed had spent 15 years walking into situations that would have paralyzed most people. He didn't know that she'd already survived things that would have broken him. He just knew that he'd won. For now. The waiting room clock read 6:17 a.m. when Dr. Hargrove walked through the automatic doors, still in yesterday's cologne, still convinced he'd arrived to salvage a disaster. He'd gotten the call at home, cardiac tamponade, resident frozen, some nurse playing surgeon in the dark. By the time he reached the hospital, the crisis had resolved without him. Colonel Webb's monitors showed steady sinus rhythm. O2 sat 98%. Blood pressure stable at 116/74. Everything that should have required his intervention, his expertise, his name in the chart, had been handled by someone else. He stood at the ICU entrance for exactly 4 seconds, watching Danielle adjust Webb's for line with a kind of clinical precision that made his chest tighten. She didn't see him. She never did. That was part of what made this unbearable. The invisibility she wore like body armor was the same armor that let her slip between moments of genuine competence that threatened the careful hierarchy he'd spent 23 years constructing. Board memberships. Speaking fees. The title to military medicine consultant on 3 different letterheads. The respect that came from being the only person in the room who understood both combat medicine and hospital administration. And now some temporary nurse with 2 years on a resume was extracting fluid from hearts while residents watched and learned the wrong lessons entirely. Hargrove turned on his heel and walked toward his office. The executive suite occupied the 4th floor, 3 rooms away from administration, positioned between power and plausible deniability. He closed the door. He sat at his desk, cherry wood, imported, cost him $8,000 at an auction he'd attended with the hospital CEO. He picked up the phone. "Gerald, it's Hargrove." "Yes, I know it's early." Gerald Moss, chairman of the board, answered on the second ring. Hargrove had contributed $47,000 to Moss's daughter's equestrian program. Moss owed him favors the way most men owed oxygen. "We have a patient safety issue that requires immediate board attention." "No, not the patient, his stable. It's the provider. Our night shift nurse exceeded her scope of practice during an emergency. Performed a procedure reserved for physicians. I have documentation." Hargrove's voice remained level, clinical, utterly reasonable. "I'm concerned about liability, about the precedent this sets. If we don't address this now, we're inviting every nurse in this hospital to decide for themselves when protocols don't apply." The conversation lasted 90 seconds. Gerald promised to make calls. Hargrove hung up and immediately dialed Dr. Patricia Chen, who sat on 3 hospital committees and whose research funding depended on Hargrove's support. Then Dr. Michael Torres, the chief of medical staff. Then the 3 other board members whose names appeared on Hargrove's mental list, not as colleagues but as assets, investments, relationships that could be leveraged when the architecture of authority needed reinforcement. By 7:56 a.m., Hargrove had activated his network with the precision of a man defusing a bomb. Each call was identical in structure: acknowledge the crisis, express concern, plant the seed that this wasn't personal but professional, that it was about standards and safety and the integrity of the institution. None of them knew each other had received the same call. None of them needed to. The pattern would emerge on its own, the way it always did. By noon, it would look less like coordinated action and more like unified professional concern. The distinction mattered legally. Then he pulled up Danielle's employment file on his computer. 2 years of evaluations, all competent, all unremarkable. Before that, nothing. The resume went back exactly 24 months. No prior employment listed. No references from previous hospitals. No continuity. In 47 years of hiring practices, Hargrove had learned that a resume gap like that meant one of 3 things: witness protection, substance abuse recovery, or something worse that people didn't want discovered. He picked up the phone again and called the 3 facilities listed as her references. The first call took 19 minutes. St. Michael's Hospital in San Antonio had no record of anyone named Danielle Ross ever working in their system. The second call took 11 minutes. Memorial Health in Austin had no record either. The third facility, a smaller urgent care in Corpus Christi, connected him to an administrator who pulled records and said, very carefully, "I'm not at liberty to discuss employment history without a signed release." The way she said it, the hesitation before each word, told Hargrove everything. Someone had worked there. Someone had left under circumstances that required legal silence. He hung up and smiled. This was better than he'd expected. This wasn't just scope of practice violation. This was a candidate for federal investigation. At 8:15 a.m., Hargrove composed an email to the hospital's chief compliance officer, Jennifer Vickers. Subject line: urgent, credential verification concern, RN Danielle Ross. The email was surgical. Professional. Concerned. He outlined the timeline of last night's events, referenced hospital policy on delegation of medical procedures, noted the significant gaps in her employment history, and requested an immediate third-party credential verification review through the hospital's federal oversight contractor. He CC'd the CEO, the chief medical officer, and Gerald Moss. By clicking send at 8:22 a.m., Hargrove had transformed a single humiliation into institutional machinery. Jennifer Vickers called him back at 9:06 a.m. "I need to move fast on this," she said. "If there's a credentialing gap and she's practicing outside her scope, we have federal reporting requirements. CMS could come down on us." "I understand," Hargrove said. "I'm not trying to destroy anyone. I just can't ignore what I witnessed. Patient safety has to come first." By 9:16 a.m., a credential verification company out of Dallas had been contracted for immediate review. They would contact all listed employers, educational institutions, and references. They would pull certification records. They would do what they always did, authenticate the narrative that Danielle's resume created. And when they discovered that 3-year gap, when they started asking questions about why a hospital would refuse to provide employment history without legal documentation, when federal compliance officers started getting involved, the story would write itself. Danielle was still in the ICU at 10:15 a.m., checking Colonel Webb's hemodynamic parameters, running through a series of assessments that should have required a physician's verification but that she performed with the kind of expertise that made her dangerous. She didn't know yet. No one had called her. No one had informed her that a 3-prong investigation was already in motion: compliance, credentialing, federal oversight. This was Hargrove's innovation. Don't tell her. Let her keep working. Let her keep demonstrating the confidence that proved she knew she was operating outside her scope. Let every action become evidence. At 10:53 a.m., Jennifer Vickers called Danielle. "We need to discuss some procedural concerns. Can you come to my office?" By 11:22 a.m., Danielle was sitting across from Jennifer's desk, still in her scrubs, still running on the adrenaline and sleeplessness of a 12-hour shift, while Jennifer explained that there were questions about her credential history. Not accusations. Just questions. A routine review. Nothing to worry about, but given the timing and the procedure performed last night, the hospital had a responsibility to be thorough. You'll need to provide written documentation from every employer listed on your resume, Jennifer said. And we'll need to contact your references. Some of them aren't responding as expected. Danielle's hands, which had been steady during an emergency extraction of pericardial fluid, began to tremble slightly. She pressed them flat against her thighs. Of course, she said. Whatever you need. And Danielle, I need your badge. Effective immediately, you're on administrative suspension pending the outcome of the credential review. It's standard procedure. You'll be paid for the duration. This should be resolved within a week. The room tilted. Not dramatically. Just a slight shift in gravity where everything that had been stable suddenly felt like it was sliding. I'm suspended. Pending review, Jennifer said again, not unkindly. I'm sorry. I know this is difficult. By noon, Danielle's badge had been surrendered. By 12:48 p.m., she was driving home in scrubs that smelled like antiseptic and someone else's blood. By 1:15 p.m., she was pulling into her driveway on Riverside Drive, a modest two-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood where no one knew her name beyond the holiday card she sent but didn't sign. By 2:03 p.m., Marcus, her 15-year-old son, named after his godfather, Colonel Marcus Webb, would come home from early rot dismissal to find his mother sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, still in her hospital clothes, staring at nothing. She didn't hear him come in. That was what frightened him most. His mother, who survived his father's death, who held them together through the bankruptcy and the moves and the nights when bills piled up higher than hope, was sitting at their kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface like she'd forgotten how to move them. Mom. She looked up. One tear was visible on her left cheek, just one, as if she'd managed to contain the rest through pure force of will. Why are you home? His voice cracked on the second word. She never broke. He had never seen his mother break. I had to leave work early. Did something happen to Colonel Webb? Chen's mom, she texted. She said you did something incredible. She said you saved him. The name hit her like a physical blow. Colonel Webb. Her commanding officer for the last 2 years of her Navy career. The man who'd recommended her for her last promotion. The man she'd sworn to protect and then walked away from when the nightmares became a roommate she couldn't evict. I made a mistake, Danielle said. At work. They suspended me. You made a mistake. Marcus sat across from her, his ROTC uniform still crisp, his uniform still intact. You saved someone's life. That's not how they see it. Colonel Webb is a good man. He'll fix this. He'll tell them. Danielle shook her head. He doesn't know me. The lie tasted like copper. Like blood in a hospital corridor. Like every choice she'd made to disappear. Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. His palm was warm. His grip was steady. He will, he said. When he finds out, he will. Outside, the first rain of the season began, steady and relentless, drumming against the windows like Morse code trying to tell her something she'd spent 2 years refusing to hear. The rain kept coming. Steady. Relentless. Drumming against the kitchen windows like Morse code trying to tell her something she'd spent 2 years refusing to hear. Danielle sat at the table in her scrubs, still wearing them, hadn't even moved to change, her head in her hands, shoulders trembling with a violence she thought she'd locked away 15 years ago. The badge lay on the tile floor where she'd set it down when she walked through the door at 12:51 p.m., still clipped to the lanyard. She couldn't bring herself to pick it up. Her hands. Hands that had held Colonel Webb's life together at 2 in the morning. Hands that had moved through a cardiac tamponade with the kind of muscle memory that doesn't come from textbooks. Hands that had saved a man while an entire night shift watched through the glass partition. Those same hands had cost her everything she'd built in the last 2 years. Practicing medicine without a license. The words echoed in her head like a sentence being read aloud at a court-martial. Hargrove had moved fast, called the Texas Medical Board himself, activated some network of board members who depended on his consulting fees and his reputation. The hospital administrator had looked genuinely sorry when they'd asked for her badge. "It's just protocol," he'd said. "We have to follow procedure." Protocol. As if procedure mattered more than the fact that Webb was alive, because she knew exactly where the pericardial space was and how to breach it without damaging the heart underneath. The scratching sound of her own breathing filled the empty kitchen. 4 o'clock would come. Then 5. Then her son would walk through that door with his junior rock backpack slung over one shoulder, still in his uniform, expecting to find his mother doing what she always did, working, healing, moving forward with a kind of relentless competence that made survival look like indifference. She wasn't sure she could do that anymore. At 3:11 p.m., Marcus pushed open the kitchen door and stopped. The backpack slipped from his shoulder and hit the tile with a dull thud. Rainwater dripped from his uniform jacket. His mother, the woman who hadn't sat down during a shift in 8 hours, who'd raised him alone after his father died, who never cried, who moved through every crisis like someone had welded steel into her spine, was crying. Actually crying. Head down, shoulders shaking, hands pressed against her face like she was trying to hold herself together with her own grip. "Mom." His voice came out thin. Uncertain. 15 years old and suddenly standing in a kitchen that felt like it had tilted on its axis. "Why are you home? What happened? Are you hurt?" Danielle lifted her head. She could see him trying to process it. The uniform still had hospital badge dirt on the shoulder from when he'd sat next to Colonel Webb during rounds, his commanding officer, the man who'd written him a letter of recommendation for the Naval Academy. The boy's jaw was doing that thing it did when he was scared, a slight tremor that reminded her painfully of his father. She couldn't tell him. The words lodged somewhere between her throat and her heart, trapped behind a wall of silence that had taken 2 years to build and 30 seconds to shatter. How do you explain to your child that you were someone else? That the woman who'd taught him to be brave was actually someone who'd crawled through IED-filled streets in Ramadi with nothing but a medical kit and a prayer? That she'd chosen to disappear from an entire life because the nightmares had become so loud she couldn't hear anything else? How do you tell a 15-year-old that his mother was a senior chief petty officer in a war he was too young to remember? That she'd earned decorations she kept in a box under her bed, never looking at them, never speaking about them? That she'd walked away from everyone, her unit, her family, the entire structure of her identity, and chosen instead to be invisible, to be forgettable, to be just another nurse in a hospital where nobody asked questions about the scars or the empty stare or the way her hand shook sometimes in the middle of the night? "I was suspended," she heard herself say. The words came out flat. Clinical. Like she was reporting vital signs. Protocol violation. "They said I overstepped my scope." Marcus set his backpack down slowly. He was still wearing his Drott uniform, navy blue pants with the gold stripe, the shirt pressed sharp, the insignia perfect. He looked so much like his father in that moment. Same angle to his shoulders. Same way of standing when he was trying to process something that didn't make sense. "But you saved him. Colonel Webb. The entire night shift saw you. Emily texted me. She said everyone was talking about it, how you knew exactly what to do, how you were faster than the attending." His voice was climbing. Frustration mixed with confusion. "Mom, you literally saved his life. How is that overstepping?" She didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Because the answer meant opening the door to everything, and once that door was open, it wouldn't close again. The rain intensified. A sudden gust slammed against the windows and made the whole kitchen rattle. The worn combat boots sat in the corner of the kitchen, wrapped in a brown paper bag from this morning, Colonel Webb's boots, the ones she'd carefully preserved when he'd arrived unconscious at Oak Creek Memorial 3 days ago. She'd kept them in the break room locker, protected them, treated them with the kind of respect that came from understanding exactly what those boots had walked through. And Hargrove had seen that as a threat. Marcus moved to the table and sat across from her, his young face trying so hard to understand. What's going to happen? Can you appeal? Can you get it back? The question hung between them like a confession waiting to happen. She looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw for the first time that he was becoming someone she didn't fully know. A young man with his father's determination, his own quiet strength, standing in a uniform that meant something he was only beginning to understand. He was at an age where he deserved to know the truth. He was also at an age where the truth might break something. I don't know, she said. And that was the most honest thing she'd said all day. Outside, the rain continued its assault, each drop hitting the window with a sound like a tiny warning. The kitchen filled with the smell of wet concrete and ozone, the world pressing in from beyond the glass. Danielle's phone sat on the counter, dormant and dark. She hadn't checked messages in 4 hours. She wasn't sure she wanted to. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the look in Marcus's eyes. The moment when he realized that the woman sitting across from him, the one who'd always had answers, who'd never broken, who'd become invisible by sheer force of will, was someone he didn't actually know at all. The moment when the distance between them suddenly became visible, measured in questions unasked and truths untold. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm. Solid. It was the gesture of a son trying to hold on to someone he thought he understood, only to realize that person was standing on the edge of a cliff he couldn't see. Neither of them spoke. The rain drummed on. And somewhere beyond that kitchen, beyond Houston, beyond the boundaries of the life she'd carefully constructed, forces were already moving. Pentagon channels were opening. Classified files were being pulled from archives. A 2-star general was reviewing incident reports from Oak Creek Memorial with the kind of attention that classified operations received. 72 hours remained before someone knocked on this door with information that would change everything. Danielle didn't know it yet. But her real life was already walking toward her through the rain, and she couldn't stop it anymore. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about the quiet heroes who save lives in the dark. Leave a comment. What would you have done if you were standing in that kitchen? Like and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next when the Pentagon arrives.